This is a secure Cyber Connect podcast with Jay Adamson and Warren Atkinson, where we're joined by information and cybersecurity, technology and talent acquisition professionals who share their journeys, unique perspectives and offer advice and guidance. Our topics on this episode will be how to drive improvement within cyber posture. Today we're pleased to be joined by Steve Lau. Steve is a cybersecurity elder, having seen many aspects of the challenges that organizations large and small have had to face. He's worked for startups within hyper-growth environments, including Mimecast, Rapid7 and Bridewell, alongside medium-sized companies such as RSA Security, and large enterprises, including organizations such as Microsoft for over 11 years, along with HP and PwC. This has made him extremely comfortable working directly with the board, security architects, developers, business people, and everyday users of technology. After 30 years as a cybersecurity professional, Steve continues to be both curious and intrigued about how to bring to bear technology and people-based security controls to enable businesses to flourish, whilst being confident that their risk profile is aligned with their appetite to risk. He has worked in technical support, marketing, product management and public relations, and consulting, and remains passionate about leading positive change both in organisations that employ him directly alongside his own clients. His love of mentoring and coaching people who are much earlier within their journeys into cyber is fueled by the fact that they often ask thought-provoking questions and challenge the status quo, which itself is an ever-moving feast given the pace of the technological innovations. In recent years, Steve has placed a lot of focus on becoming more present and aware of how this subconscious often drives his behaviour. He is trained and is professionally qualified as a shadow work and a breathwork facilitator, and coaches both himself and others to see where the subconscious grabs hold of the wheel in response to old programming. Steve, welcome to the Secure Cyber Connect podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Jay. Hi, Warren. Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
So, would you give us just a very brief, high-level overview about some of the key themes that we're going to be exploring in our episode?
Well, the areas I'm really interested in is how can organizations improve their security with the effort they're able to put onto that. So it's quite often for organizations to spend an awful lot of time, an awful lot of money, and not really see tangible improvement. So my focus has been, where's that sweet spot where we understand clearly what the business is doing and how can security make that more sustainable?
And our opening is usually always the same with our guests. For you, if you'd kindly share something you may be proud or excited about that isn't typically featured on the LinkedIn profile.
I'm proud about helping people. It's easy to get lost in the technology. And I used to be a developer. I've always liked the shiny, technical, latest things that are coming up. But what I found from experience is often helping the people that makes the most difference. And that's what's most satisfying for me. So I put a lot of focus on how do I help teams work better with each other? How do I help people express their needs? How do I ask the right questions and teach others to ask the right questions to understand what's really important?
Oh, that's amazing. And can you perhaps share with us one significant challenge that you faced in your career that's perhaps shaped your view on cybersecurity in most recent years?
I think the biggest thing has been too many choices. When I started in this industry, security is complicated. It's partly what drew me to it. And if you look at most large organizations now, they've got multiple technologies that are trying to solve the same problem, managed in different places, with different relationships with suppliers, different levels of sophistication. And quite often they just make life more difficult.
I suppose leading from that and understanding a little bit more about the current cyber landscape, what do you think the most pressing sort of cyber threats are that organizations have faced today, and how do you think these threats have evolved within the landscape?
I think it's a mix of many things. It's people are busy, people have lots of things to do, they have quite complicated jobs typically. And this is across all organizations, all different roles. And when things seem too good to be true, they usually are. When things seem like a good shortcut, they might be, but then they might bring baggage with them. So for me, it's about understanding what's most important for the business. What are the risks in terms of people's understanding, which is often a common weakness. We're busy doing day to day. Everyone's not a cyber professional. Let's face it, life would be quite dull if they were. And it's what do we need people to understand so that they can avoid some of the obvious problems that aren't obvious to them.
And how do you think leaders can stay informed about emerging threats to make these decisions?
I think they can do a mix of things. They can look at cybersecurity sources that are well trusted, which are quite well published. So things like the NTSC in the UK is a really good source of unbiased, unambiguous information. They can take what they see in the press as interesting, but sometimes not representative of reality in some of the detail. So if you just read the headlines, you can get one view of the world. If you look at the experts, what they're saying, you can get quite a different view. So we still see a lot of the same problems, things like systems patching. This has been an age-old problem. And yet you still get organizations who wait 3 or 4 weeks before applying an update in case it breaks something. And there's people like me who for many years have said, you need to speed that up because people who are attacking, even if it's automated or direct, aren't going to wait that long. And then you get breaches like CrowdStrike breach, where if you had the latest updates and the tools straight away, you would have had a problem by default. So it's a difficult balance in terms of how exposed are you by things going wrong? Can you roll back to the previous version? Do you have the ability to roll back to your very recent data if you've had, say, a ransomware attack? And often that's more important than getting the latest bells and whistles and capabilities from a security technology. Can you cover the basics of what do you do if it all goes wrong? Can we roll back to when it was last good? How do we know when that was? And that's such not exciting, but it's basic business continuity. And I think we need to give more focus to that than perhaps some organizations do at the moment.
Definitely, but
Yeah, it's brilliant. And on the subject of perhaps cybersecurity management systems, what are the common pitfalls you're seeing across large enterprise organizations versus perhaps small to medium-sized organizations, and how are the conversion is?
I find my biggest thing is too much complexity. Security shouldn't bring in a lot of extra complexity. Some of the technologies do implicitly. If you're encrypting data, then that's making life more difficult. And yet if you're using built-in capabilities to the systems you have, they can be relatively easy to manage these days. It used to be far more complex.
Are there certain things that organizations perhaps should be avoiding in terms of when they're growing that journey to enhance their cybersecurity frameworks that are working towards perhaps?
So frameworks is a little bit of a trigger for me in some respects. And if you look at any of the major frameworks like ISO 27001, NIST, or even CAF, which is more recent, they require a lot of organizations treat this like a tick box exercise. They bring in a consultant or they do it in-house. You run through hundreds of questions and try and get a view of where are they. And that can be really useful, but equally can be distracting. It can be useful in getting a view for where do we need to be more mature, where are we more at risk. But it can be distracting in taking it as if we've got to green in each of those areas, then we've done enough. Whereas I think the reality is we need to understand for the way our particular organization works, or this particular organization works from a business perspective, what are the realistic risks that are there? And what are the areas that need more emphasis than others? And I think that's where there's some art in doing cybersecurity well. It's what's the least that we can do, and do it well and do it regularly and measure its effectiveness regularly, which will have a big impact on our security posture, rather than trying to do everything everywhere to the nth degree. And what we find is we don't have enough time to do that in most organizations. Even if you work for an organization with a lot of budget and a big team, it can still be very difficult to do everything everywhere. The challenge is how much do we do when it's enough? And I think, as I say, that's where it tends to be a little bit of an art. Some of that comes from experience. Automation can make it easier to deal with some of the low-hanging fruit. But a lot of organizations get stuck in the, this is too hard, or the, yeah, we've got that covered. And the reality is I think you need people and technology which are still curious to, is there something we need to do more in? Is there somewhere we could do less? Could we remove some conflicting technologies that are trying to achieve the same thing? Could we have fewer security solutions, fewer security vendors in our client? Could we have less controls? And the idea of that for some people is quite scary, but if they're not effective, then those controls are just bringing baggage.
Makes sense. And for smaller organizations that perhaps don't have the resource or even the dedicated teams internally, what are the initial steps they should perhaps take? Should they look externally for consultants?
Thank you. And I think that's a good question. So I'd encourage them to do something meaningful, whether that's spend a limited amount of budget on getting an external expert to come in to give an outside view, whether it's putting some of the people I have in the business on a training course or give them some time to look into things themselves, whether it's acquiring a tool that might help them do this as well. It's about making a step forward and understanding what have we got covered reasonably well. A place people often can get a lot of value is by helping the people who are using the technology, help the end users understand security better. And that means typically I like short videos, maybe short in-person sessions if it's an organization that meets in the same physical space. Maybe it's online sessions, but things that are short to the point. Warren, did you know X? Why would you care about that? What could you do about that? Who do you go and talk to if you think something doesn't look okay? And give you the ability to make some choices and decisions yourselves and start to get a feel for if things don't look right.
Yeah, makes sense. And you're building that trust internally, it enables that, I think.
I think it's also making it so that security is not just a specialist problem or issue. Make it so everyone's got some responsibility, but don't blind them with signs. Don't expect them to learn everything. Just give them what's the least they need to know to be more effective in helping in the security effort.
I think it's important to enable and empower as opposed to overloading people. And yeah, from your perspective, are there any fundamental changes that are perhaps necessary in the cybersecurity landscape that dramatically need to change?
I think a lot of organizations are still quite flat in terms of where their data is. So I've worked with clients large and small for a long time, and I tend to find these days it's quite hard to get access to anything when you start as a new joiner or if you come in as an external. But once you get the authentication and you've got the basics covered, then you tend to find there's usually one large data store which has got access to most of the things you need in it. So it's still the old-fashioned guidance, but role-based access control is key. Put users in groups, figure out what the groups need access to for that role, and have a clear process of if somebody leaves, if somebody changes role, gets promoted, moves sideways, maybe takes some time out to do something different in the business, moves in a lateral direction, make sure that they only have access still to the things they then need access to. That's something that I was talking about, like many people 10, 20 years ago. It's still a big factor. People tend to acquire more and more access to things over time. And
Yeah.
well,
Things get left behind as well and forgotten, especially if there's sort of a period of change for the organisation. And on that subject, what role does collaboration and knowledge share play within facilitating these necessary changes? How important is that?
I think collaboration, information sharing among people who have a reason to trust each other is really important. And that can be other organizations. If you've got organizations that work in the same space as you, do the same sort of thing as you, it can be really valuable to share what you've learned. Not giving competitive advantage, but simply saying, we found this source of information really useful. This threat intelligence feed is particularly important. Maybe there's some templates. Maybe there's some consultants you worked with or third parties who really added some value. People who gave you we thought we were pretty good and we invited this person in and they gave us a whole different perspective. So I think you get real good understanding of how a particular type of business works. That can really be transferable. Collaboration within businesses, I think, is around making it so that if there's a breach, if there's a security exposure, if there's some kind of knowledge of something's not gone to plan, then have a culpability review, then start looking at blame and shaming and trying to point a finger, but instead have a culture where people can go, actually, I got that wrong. Or, yeah, I did let my kids use the laptop, or I did leave it unattended somewhere, or any of the things you can imagine, make it so that there's a way to share that in a way that helps everybody, instead of it being shaming. Because if it's shaming, people tend not to talk about things.
Most definitely. And I think if you open up and you're open and honest, it's that human element that encourages other people to perhaps speak up when they've made mistakes as well, and even learn from yours if you share them in that respect.
If people feel comfortable, it's like asking, how are you feeling today? Most people have this default answer and feel they need to say, yeah, I'm okay. Not say, well, actually something really dramatic happened on the way here. I had a really difficult experience. Something's going on in life, which is very hard to deal with. And if we encourage people to be able to share those things, then we're more able to be there for them and be supportive of them. And it doesn't mean we should put them away from them or try and wrap it up in cotton wool, but having an understanding of how each other is feeling can help. And the same can be true around cyber. If your job is nothing to do with technology, you've been told by the IT team, you've been told by senior management that we as an organization need to do more around cyber. Maybe you went on a training course, maybe it was useful and it was short and it was compelling, but you've forgotten some of it and you're in the middle of trying to meet some deadline. Being able to openly actually ask, Jay, I can't quite remember the thing you trained us on last week. Can you maybe I've just got 5 minutes. What can I do to kind of pick that up? Or can someone help me get this thing across the line in the meantime? And then I can learn some more. And that's a much better environment than many organizations have.
Yeah, and I've also seen organisations perhaps sort of practice the culture of the gift of giving. If you give something to someone, they give back something in return. And as I mentioned just now, the human element, showing that vulnerability is very important in that respect.
But there's also something related to that where, I don't know if you ever come across this, but human nature, if I tell you something that appears to be really vulnerable, that appears really sensitive to me, I tell you a secret, then as human nature, we tend to feel comfortable. We tend to feel that we can then start to share things, almost feel the need, I should share something too. So around social engineering, that can be really powerful if somebody's trying to compromise your employees, your team. I could make up some nonsense that sounds really compelling, it sounds really honest. So part of what we need to train our people is around questioning how much they share with people who they have no reason to trust. And I'm not suggesting that we make everyone super suspicious. And there's a real gift to being vulnerable in a workplace around building relationships and encouraging people to be themselves. But there is a balance of, just because I tell you something that appears to be sensitive doesn't mean you need to do the same back, especially if I don't work for the organization. I'm not a partner. There's not some reason that we should build that trust.
Yeah, because I see a lot of threat actors, especially on the social engineering side of things, sort of trying to validate things by sharing parts of information that perhaps are true. And they're getting that from open sources, social media, that sort of thing. I think a lot of it obviously comes down to understanding yourself as an organization, and going back to what you mentioned earlier, that the risk assessment and putting assessments in place in the early stages is very important. But for some organizations, they don't really know where to start. So could you explain to us what those cybersecurity assessments entail and why they're crucial, both small and large organizations?
Yeah, it's an interesting area. It's that where do I start question, I think. And it's the place I start, and a lot of professionals start, is looking at the organization online. So using what's called open source information, so anything in the public domain, and trying to get a feel for what's the organization about. If it's a commercial organization particularly, is there an annual report? Is there a statement of where the organization is going? What's it aspiring to do? What does it measure itself by? And get a feel for what kind of information is in the organization. And then when talking directly with the organization, asking questions based on that. So I understand that you're trying to grow by this percentage in this market with this kind of product. Ask open questions around what sort of information is involved. How valuable is that information? How long does that information have value? What's the consequence of it being exposed? It may be financial, it may be regulatory, it may be reputational, it could be something else. And these things apply outside of commercial organizations as well. So for not-for-profits, charities, but trying to really understand what data is involved in making the organization tick. People often forget that information is usually of more value when it's first created or first used than later in time. That's not true for every organization. So it's about, if you understand the data and the value of the data, then you can start to ask questions around what kind of controls are in place. People tend to assume controls are just technical controls, and they can be. But processes, policies, procedures, security awareness, what people understand as risk are equally important. So if you get someone who loves technology, try and ask them questions, also try and get a feel for how much they understand about those other parts. If you come across a small organization, you may find one person who's all over this and really gets the security side of things. What happens if they're not available, if they're on holiday, off sick? Maybe they've left the organization at short notice. Who's going to step in? What's the means for them to step in and take over? Those are the sorts of things that I tend to ask around. So how does security work? And then how well documented is how security works? And if there's lots of documentation, is that documentation reflecting what actually happens? So what an organization typically does is they will document as best they can their security policies, practices, procedures. The audit typically comes and tries to get a feel for, is what's documented matching what they actually do? And usually they've had an external person come in with good intentions, who's done what's been asked, and they've documented how the organization thinks it does those things, but they haven't actually lived and breathed what happens. And especially what happens when times get short, deadlines are coming up, the business needs to do something quickly, shortcuts maybe need to be taken. Are those things documented? What happens if there's an incident? How does the business still operate? There might be an incident management plan, which is well documented. Has it been tested? Has there been a dry run of that? Those sorts of things can be quite interesting. I had a client recently, and I was asking about their incident management procedure, And they said to me that a building had blown up down the road, and actually that had happened. So the incident was nothing to do with their organization, but it had a profound impact on their physical access to the environment. So lots of what if questions.
That's really interesting. And when you do get those findings, how best can you perhaps translate those assessment findings and map that to a priority for the business? How do organisations, or how would you go about that?
I think prioritization is the key thing. Pragmatic advice of we will start from wherever we are as organisations or people, and there might be somewhere we need to get to for a regulatory reason, or we wish to get to for competitive advantage, or something in between. But the challenge is, how do you prioritize? What do you do first? Human nature, we tend to go, I was going to say go crazy is perhaps the wrong term, but we tend to put too much emphasis on the place where we've been told are weakest. What we actually need to do is focus on the areas that need the most improvement, but also make sure everything moves up at the right rate. So I think it's very useful to have a step back on a regular basis have some kind of metrics to give a view of where you are. And then rather than just focusing on the area where there's most to do, keep a comparison of how it compares to the other areas. So for example, if your backups are poor, if you can't restore to a point in time, and someone said that makes you very vulnerable to a ransomware attack or recovering from one, then it's easy to have a big project to deal with that. Maybe very expensive, easy is perhaps the wrong word, but to put the focus in that space and actually forget that your end users don't know the importance of only storing data on the central storage area, not sharing information with people outside the organization, questioning if things seem too good to be true. So I think a lot of the old things that we were trying to do 10, 20 years ago are as important now as they ever were. And of course, lots of new things as well.
We've talked a little bit about knowledge sharing and the importance of that within, obviously, organizational culture. In terms of influencing sort of cybersecurity practices, what other steps can leaders take to foster a security-first mindset amongst their teams and the organization as a whole?
I think there's a really important place for leaders of organizations to get directly involved with security, not in terms of implementing it, but talking about it, making it okay to talk about it, leading by example. So lots of senior leaders have made their own security mistakes, and it's actually quite empowering to share some of those. So I think leading by example is a key thing they can do, and then giving people time to focus on these things. So of course, there's a financial cost usually of making people focus on things that aren't maybe their day job. But if you give people a bit of freedom and a bit of space, they can start to be more curious and start to ask more questions.
And have you yourself seen any successful initiatives that maybe you've seen the transformation close within the sort of cultural change within the businesses you've worked?
Yeah, many. The place I've seen the most significant change of security posture is where the senior leaders in the business have made it a topic that they talk about regularly. And they've made it so they speak about things that are engaging to do with security, and made it part of their day. What did they do differently? What did security mean to them? Not in terms of something they must do, but in terms of how they do the things they do in their day job.
And going forward, Steve, where do you see the emerging trends and technologies that are probably going to have the most significant impact on cyber over the next few years? And how can organizations prepare for these constant changes within tech?
I think one of the most interesting ones is AI around security. AI generally, of course, is a big buzzword, and I think it can drive a lot of distraction. It can also be very powerful. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. There are tools using AI to try and automatically find the low-hanging fruit, the unperhaps systems, the applications that are vulnerable, the configurations which could be changed relatively easily. But I think it can be a big distraction as well. So I think it needs to be put in the right context. People are still talking about things like quantum cryptography, which isn't going to go away. It's sooner or later going to become more of a factor as well. But I think we need to keep focusing on the basics. Some things, as I've said a couple of times, 10, 20 years ago were still as much of a problem. User awareness, patching systems, patching applications, backing up data, role-based access control, good authentication, thinking about trust boundaries, visible security. These things are still as big a problem now as they ever were.
What advice would you give? Well, Puth with, I guess, anyone who's looking to come over it, you can stay or senior professional to ensure that they continue to grow and thrive within this space?
So I'd encourage people who are new to the sector to look seriously about joining. I'd encourage them to come in. I think the thing that people from outside cyber getting into it bring us a whole different perspective. They don't have the baggage and the history of this is how things should be done. They don't have the standardized approach of the security department takes care of security for you. We should use standards wherever we can, which can be very valuable. I'd encourage people who have been in the security for a long time to become more curious and to try and step away from security sometimes and spend more time with the business. Maybe even take a little bit of time out of security and go in, even if you just shadow somebody who's doing some of the work some of the end users do, because it gives a different perspective. I remember many years ago, I worked in a data center doing a project, and the project was to do something highly complex in security. And the architecture that's been followed said have 5 different firewalls back to back. And this is for a data center supporting 1 million users, so the cost of doing so was bearable. But the complexity that it brought was so significant, they would have been much better off having 2 firewalls back to back and hiring the absolute experts who knew those inside out and configuring them as best as possible. We're keeping an eye on those configurations and trying to get 5 experts back to back, because the amount of gaps between them will bound to be more. So there was a pragmatic issue of what's actually going to make the most difference versus academically what might make the most difference. So I think everyone needs to be curious. Everyone needs to be empowered to ask what seem like silly questions. And also to keep reading, keep studying, keep taking courses, keep looking at threat intelligence. What are the attackers doing? Things like the MITRE attack framework, I think, is a really useful perspective of what are the most common forms of compromise. And then not just focusing on web like something that IWASP typically does, which again is very useful, but MITRE can give a perspective of we never even thought of migrating that way. Why would we need controls in that area? Covering many of the typical attacks. It can be very powerful.
Open source ones or free ones.
I think the NTSC is a really good place to start because it covers, it's UK focused, it's not created for commercial gain, and it covers everything from individuals, end users, small organizations, either sole traders or small limited companies, medium size and enterprise. And it has links to lots of other resources. So of all the places I've looked, I think that's if I could recommend one site, it would be that one. But there were some other really good sites out there.
On sort of senior leaders or perhaps those that are in high pressure environments, health and well-being, burnout's obviously a key concern for a lot of organizations and individuals. So from your experience, how can all professionals really balance that professional and personal life to ensure that they're in a good sound state of mind?
It's a really good question. I think you've got issues around cyber specifically of if there's been a breach, if there's been an incident, if there's been something significant happen. Most plans don't cover how do you look after people. How do you look after people who suddenly their world's been turned upside down? Large organizations often have some kind of third party which can provide wellbeing services, usually telephone based from my experience, but actually put more thought into what would the organization do to support its people. I think as we try to look at more and more areas in business, it's easy to get overwhelmed, overloaded, help people prioritize. And help people take time to look after their own well-being. So you remember when people brought in, I sound like a really old person now, but remember when we had mobile phones coming in and do we use them for work or do we have a separate work phone? What happens if we get called out of hours? Should we respond? Is that important?
Wasn't that long ago, Steve?
It probably is by the years, but it doesn't seem it. It's that balance of, should I be working in this moment? Is this urgent right now? Should somebody else be doing this? Am I the right person to respond? Do I have the right amount of training? Do I have the right support? Are there things that I could value by having in terms of guidance? Is there a mentor that could help me? Should I ask for a mentor? Should I be mentoring? Should I be sharing my experience? People across businesses where they really care about each other as individuals can help each other a lot in ways that aren't obvious. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. Of the 3 things that are my top priorities now, which one would you like me not to do so I can take on this new thing that's urgent? They're trying to help people deal with overload, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Supporting teams in that, taking a genuine interest in, how are you doing today? And you being able to feel free to say how you really are instead of what you think you should say, I think is really important.
Some good advice, Steve. And we always ask our guests the analogy question. And we've had some good sayings and analogies throughout the episodes. I think less is more would certainly be one that's come up from some of the previous conversations we've had today. What's your good analogy, Steve, from a work perspective or in general, if of course you can say on the episode?
That's a really interesting question. I think if things don't feel right, ask questions, be curious, get help. There's no such thing as a silly question. Everyone gets busy and it's okay to be busy. But if you feel that you're overwhelmed, particularly trying to take on things like security when you don't know enough about it, ask for help and have a culture where people feel comfortable being able to say, you know what, I think I might have made a mistake. I might have clicked on something that wasn't what I thought it was. Instead of burying it, hiding from it, have a culture where people can go, you know what, Jay, I think I made a mistake. And then for people to be curious, how can we help in that? How can we get the right result? And then look afterwards of what could we do differently to make sure it doesn't happen again.
For sure. And yourself, Steve, what does the future hold for you? And where do you see yourself going forward now? And what's on the horizon for yourself?
For me, it's keeping focus on people. So I've been a technology person for the last 30 years. I still love technology, but I'll be the first to get frustrated if technology doesn't work effectively. I think the more I know about technology, the lower my threshold is for things not working properly. So I want to spend more time mentoring and guiding cyber professionals. I want to spend more time helping organizations answer some of the questions you've asked of how are we doing? Where should we focus around cyber? What's important right now? This thing that's happened in the media, will it affect us? Do we need to do something differently? As far as how I do that, I'm not sure. I've just left an organization, nearly 4 years doing consulting for that one organization. And the thing that sticks with me is the one major client I spend a lot of time with, the way that they really understood their data, they really understood the value of their data. And that was their go-to for how do they control and implement and do the right things to keep it safe and secure. So whether I work for the consultancy, whether I work for another large organization, whether I freelance as I'm doing at the moment, who knows? I think the one thing that's safe to know is it'll be something to do with cyber. I got into it because it interested me and I figured I'll do it as long as it did. And somehow 30 years have passed. So pretty sure I'll be doing this for a long time in one way or another.
That's brilliant. We look forward to seeing where the journey takes you next.
Thank you. And for any of our listeners who want to stay connected with you beyond this podcast, where else can they reach out to you?
Thanks for asking. The best place is LinkedIn. Steve Lamb on LinkedIn. There's a few Steve Lambs on there, but I think you'll find me quite easily.
Well, Steve, thank you. Certainly the community and all our listeners will have found a lot of value in today's session. There's been some really great advice there and some superb insight. We want to continue the discussion, and for more sustained engagement, we've actually joined the Secure Cyber Connect community, where we're offering a range of collaborative solutions for both technology and security professionals at no cost, as always. These include expansive community access, cross-sector mutual mentoring programs, weekly online networking sessions, and a range of exclusive interviews such as this, panel discussions, and masterclasses. To learn more and gain access to the community and all of our initiatives, please visit secure-recruitment.com/cyber-connect/. Thank you very much.